He was only 8 years old, but Mateo Ruiz already knew what it meant to be judged by appearances. That Tuesday afternoon, she walked into the Banco Nacional branch in Madrid, carrying her 6-month-old brother in her arms, her clothes dirty from a day in the park and her hair tousled by the wind. Director Carmen Lopez looked him up and down and, without asking questions, ordered security to escort him out. What he didn't know was that Mateo was the son of Alejandro Ruiz, owner of 60% of the shares of that same bank and one of the richest men in Spain. The boy was just trying to find his dad, who was waiting for him upstairs for an important meeting. But when Alejandro discovered how his son had been treated, his reaction was so devastating that no one at that bank would ever forget it. Because sometimes a few seconds are enough to ruin a career and prove that arrogance always costs more than you think. Mateo Ruiz had learned early on that the adult world was complicated. At 8 years old, with her always tousled brown curls and those green eyes that shone with intelligence, she knew how to move with ease between office buildings and meeting rooms. His father Alejandro often took him with him when he had to work on weekends or during school holidays. And Mateo had developed an unusual maturity for his age. That Tuesday in October was no different from any other. Alejandro was scheduled to attend a crucial meeting on the 12th floor of Banco Nacional de Madrid, the credit institution in which he held a majority stake. Mateo had accompanied him along with little Lucas, 6 months old, because the nanny had gotten sick and Alejandro's wife was on a business trip in London. The morning had passed peacefully in the offices of the General Directorate. Mateo had done his homework in the waiting room while Alejandro discussed financial strategies, and little Lucas slept peacefully in his baby carrier. But around 2 p.m., Alejandro had to go down to the vault for a security check that required only his presence. Mateo waited responsibly, accustomed to these moments when he had to be the eldest in the family. But after 20 minutes of waiting, Lucas started crying and nothing could calm him down. The baby was hungry and the bottle was in the bag Alejandro had brought with him. Mateo knew that on the ground floor there was an internal cafeteria of the bank where they also sold milk and cookies. He had seen his father buy things there. He often picked up his little brother, who was still crying, and headed for the elevator. The problem was that during the descent Lucas vomited on Mateo's shirt, also dirtying his jeans. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Mateo looked like a street urchin, his clothes stained, his hair disheveled from trying to calm his brother, and his expression of concern that made him look younger than his 8 years. The bank lobby was filled with wealthy clients and executives in suits and ties. Mateo looked around for the cafeteria, but all those elegant people made him suddenly feel out of place. He timidly approached the information desk, where a young employee looked at him in puzzlement when he politely asked where the cafeteria was because his little brother was hungry. The employee abruptly interrupted him, saying that this was a bank, not a daycare center. At that moment, Carmen Lopez, the branch manager, was crossing the lobby on her way back from a meeting. She was 45 years old, had a career built on efficiency and rigor, and a reputation as a woman who did not tolerate irregularities. When he saw that dirty boy bothering the customers, his reaction was immediate and ruthless. Carmen approached with a determined step, looking Mateo up and down. He noticed the dirty clothes, the crying little brother, the disheveled appearance. He didn't ask him where he came from. He wasn't interested in the fact that I had taken the elevator from the upper floors. He didn't notice that the carrier was an expensive brand. He only saw what he wanted to see, a problem to eliminate. Without listening to Mateo's explanations, as he desperately tried to say that his father was on the 12th floor, Carmen declared that this was a private bank, not a place to beg for money. Immediately called security. 2 security agents approached as Carmen pointed at Mateo, as if he were a criminal. He ordered them to escort the children out and make sure they didn't come back. Mateo felt like the world was coming down on him. He didn't understand what was happening, why those people treated him like that. He tried to explain again that his father was waiting for him, but no one wanted to listen. The guards gently but firmly took him by the arms and escorted him toward the exit, while all the bank customers looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. As they led him outside, Mateo desperately shouted that his father's name was Alejandro Ruiz and that he was up there pleading for them to check, but Carmen had already turned away, convinced she had solved a nagging problem. He didn't know that at that moment he had just made the most serious mistake of his career, and that Alejandro Ruiz, one of the most powerful men in Spain, was about to discover that his son had been thrown out of his own bank like a beggar. Alejandro Ruiz completed his inspection of the bank's vault with the satisfaction of knowing every detail is under control. By the age of 40, he had built a financial empire that stretched from Spain to Europe, and the Banco Nacional de Madrid was the jewel in his crown. He owned 60% of the shares. He had transformed a crisis-stricken institution into one of the country's most solid banks. When he returned to the 12th floor, expecting to find Mateo and Lucas in the waiting room, he found instead only emptiness and silence. His personal assistant, Elena Marquez, saw him enter with a worried expression and explained that the children had left about an hour earlier. Mateo had said he was going to get something for his little brother. Alejandro felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Mateo was responsible for his age, but he was still an 8-year-old boy in an office building full of strangers. He immediately called internal security to review the cameras from the last hour. The answer came after a few minutes that seemed like an eternity to Alejandro. The security officer's voice was tense and embarrassed. His son had been escorted out of the bank about 40 minutes earlier. The branch manager had ordered the guards to remove the children because she had mistaken them for beggars. The silence that followed was deafening. Alejandro remained motionless for long seconds as rage grew within him like a tide. His son, the heir to his empire, had been thrown out of his own bank like a bum, and what drove him maddest was imagining the confusion and humiliation Mateo must have felt. When asked where the children were now, security confirmed that external cameras had captured them sitting on the steps of the main entrance. It seemed like they were waiting. Alejandro didn't say another word. He took the elevator and went down to the ground floor with a determination that would have made anyone tremble. When the doors opened in the lobby, everyone turned to him. Alejandro Ruiz in person at the National Bank was always an event, but that day there was something different about his presence, an aura of impending storm that made everyone uncomfortable. He headed straight for the main exit, and what he saw broke his heart. Mateo was sitting on the marble steps of the bank with Lucas in his arms, who had finally calmed down. The boy's eyes were red as if he had been crying, and when he saw his father, his face lit up with relief. Mateo shouted for him and ran towards him, saying he didn't know what to do after being made to leave. Alejandro hugged him tightly, feeling his son's small figure tremble against him. At that moment he swore to himself that whoever had done this to Mateo would pay dearly. He took Lucas from Mateo's arms and asked the son to tell him exactly what had happened. With his voice still trembling, Mateo explained everything. How he had gone down to get milk for Lucas, how the director had treated him without even listening to him, how he had been taken out by the guards despite having said he was Alejandro Ruiz's son. Each word was like a stab in Alexander's heart. His son had tried to tell who he was, but no one had believed him. They had judged him only by appearance, without dignity, without respect, without humanity. When Mateo innocently asked why that woman had been so mean and if he had done anything wrong, Alejandro looked at his son and saw in the boy's eyes a confusion that shouldn't be there. Mateo had always lived in a world where he was protected, respected, loved. That was the first time I had experienced prejudice and wanton cruelty. Alejandro assured him that he hadn't done anything wrong, but that some people had. He got up with his 2 children and went back into the bank. But this time it wasn't the important client who came to check on his investments. It was a furious father who had to do justice for the humiliation suffered by his son. And everyone at the National Bank of Madrid was about to find out what it meant to anger Alejandro Ruiz. Alejandro crossed the bank lobby with Mateo, who was holding his hand, and Lucas in his arms. His pace was measured, controlled, but everyone who knew him knew how to recognize the signs. The employees began to whisper as they watched him walk by, recognizing the child next to him as the one who had been taken out an hour earlier. He first headed to the information desk, where the employee who had turned Mateo away instantly paled upon seeing him approach. In a dangerously calm voice, Alejandro asked him if he remembered speaking to his son. The realization of what he had done washed across his face like a wave of terror. Alejandro headed for the stairs, ignoring the elevator reserved for executives. He wanted everyone to see it, for the news to spread before he arrived at Carmen Lopez's office. When he opened the door, without knocking, Carmen was on the phone. The phone slipped from his hands when he recognized who had entered. She jumped up trying to appear accommodating, but Alejandro interrupted her by pointing at Mateo. Carmen looked at the boy and felt like her world was coming down on her. It was the same one he had thrown out, but now everything took on a completely different meaning. He started to stammer something about a misunderstanding. Alejandro explained with icy calm what had happened. She had her 8-year-old son thrown out of the bank he owned majority ownership of, without checking his identity, treating him like a beggar. Carmen desperately tried to justify herself by talking about safety protocols, but Alejandro pointed out the absurdity of considering an 8-year-old child a threat. When she tried to apologize, Alejandro explained that he could not undo the humiliation he had inflicted on his son. In a definitive voice, he informed her that she was fired with immediate effect, along with every person who had participated in the episode. Carmen tried to plead, but Alejandro turned to Mateo and smiled tenderly. As they left the office, Carmen slumped in her chair, realizing that in just a few minutes she had lost everything she had worked for a lifetime. Alejandro immediately called an extraordinary meeting of the entire staff in the conference room on the first floor. Within 15 minutes, every employee in the branch was sitting across from him. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, we continue with the video. As Mateo and Lucas waited in the waiting room with Elena, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew what had happened and that the consequences would be severe. Alejandro stood up and began to speak in a calm but penetrating voice. He told what had happened. An 8-year-old boy was kicked out of the bank because someone decided he looked inappropriate. He had not been given the opportunity to explain himself. His identity had not been verified, and he had not been treated with human dignity. He explained that this was not just a personal issue, but one of values and principles. He asked direct questions about whether they were capable of judging a child, what they did with clients who didn't seem rich enough, how they treated the elderly or those who needed help. Some employees were crying, others were looking at the floor in shame. Alejandro went on to explain that the bank was not just a financial institution, but a public service where people seek security and trust. He announced the changes, including monthly training courses on social sensitivity, vetting procedures before expelling someone, and the principle that every person deserved respect. The most significant moment came when he brought Mateo into the living room. The employees stood up one by one to apologize to the boy, some with tears in their eyes, all sincerely sorry. Mateo accepted each apology with a smile and said something that stuck with everyone, that the important thing was to learn and do better next time. An 8-year-old boy had taught a room full of adults what forgiveness and personal growth meant. In the weeks that followed, Banco Nacional de Madrid embarked on a transformation that went far beyond replacing laid-off staff. Alexander did not limit himself to punishing those who had failed. He was actively committed to creating a completely new corporate culture. The first change was the appointment of a new director, Maria Santos, a 40-year-old woman who had worked for years in social services before entering the banking sector. Her experience with people from all walks of life made her a perfect fit to guide the cultural transformation Alejandro had in mind. Maria implemented the most comprehensive training program a Spanish bank had ever seen. Not just courses on social sensitivity, but real workshops that exposed employees to real-life situations. They invited people from different social backgrounds to share their experiences. They organized simulations where employees had to put themselves in the shoes of customers in difficulty. Matthew's story became the main case study, not to humiliate whoever was there that day, But to analyze each phase of the episode and understand where the system had failed, how such a simple situation could have degenerated so quickly, what psychological mechanisms had led normally gentle people to behave so harshly. Alejandro personally participated in many of these encounters, often bringing Mateo when the boy was available. Mateo, with his childlike naturalness, had unwittingly become the bank's best trainer. When I spoke to the employees, they saw not the son of a billionaire, but simply a child who deserved respect, like everyone else. The change was not only in the attitude towards customers. Alejandro also transformed the physical environment of the bank. He created a family area where parents could have their children play, installed free water dispensers. He made comfortable chairs available for the elderly, introduced a translation system to assist foreign customers. But the real revolution was in the human approach. Every employee was trained to look beyond appearances, to ask kind questions before judging, to offer help instead of creating barriers. The results were extraordinary. 6 months after Mateo's incident, Banco Nacional de Madrid had won the national award for best customer service. Social media was filled with stories of people treated with unexpected kindness and respect. Older clients wrote letters of gratitude for the help they received with digital procedures. Immigrant families shared positive experiences of inclusion and understanding. The most significant change was seen one cold December morning. A homeless man walked into the bank asking if he could use the bathroom and get warm. Instead of being thrown out, he was discreetly welcomed. He was offered a hot coffee, and when it was discovered that he had documents but no checking account, he was told how to open a free one for people in financial difficulty. That man was a war veteran who had lost everything due to mental health problems. The kindness received at the bank was the first step toward his social reintegration. 6 months later, I had found a job and opened a regular account. His story was told in national newspapers as an example of how financial institutions could be positive forces in society. Alejandro followed all these developments with satisfaction, but the true thermometer of success was Mateo. The boy, now 9 years old, often returned to the bank with his father and was always greeted with genuine smiles. He knew many of the employees by name, and they knew him, not as the owner's son, but as Mateo, a child who had unwittingly taught everyone a precious lesson. One afternoon, while walking home from a visit to the bank, Mateo asked his father if he was happy with how that ugly story had ended. Alejandro looked at his son through the rearview mirror, and Mateo explained that he had been sad that day. But then many people had learned to be more gentle. Perhaps it had been worth it. At that moment, Alejandro understood that his son had understood something much deeper than a simple lesson in justice. I understood that sometimes painful experiences can become opportunities to make the world a better place. 2 years after the incident that had shaken the National Bank of Madrid, Mateo had grown into an even more self-confident and compassionate 10-year-old boy. His experience had not made him cynical or distrustful, but had taught him the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of appearances. Alejandro often reflected on how that difficult moment had become one of the most valuable lessons of his life, not only for Mateo, but for himself. He had discovered that true power lay not in humiliating those who made mistakes, but in creating systems that prevented those mistakes from happening again. The National Bank of Madrid had become a model studied throughout Europe. Delegations from other financial institutions regularly visited the institution to study its approach to staff training and inclusive customer service. Mateo's story had become a case study in business schools, not as an example of corporate revenge, but as a demonstration of transformational leadership. The most significant changes were seen in small, everyday things. Every morning, when Alejandro walked into the bank for his meetings, he saw scenes that warmed his heart. Tellers patiently explaining procedures to elderly customers, security guards helping mothers with strollers, employees greeting each person with genuine smiles. The new director, Maria Santos, had instituted a monthly tradition called a history of kindness. Every month an employee would recount a particularly kind episode he had experienced at the bank. These stories were shared with all staff and often became examples for improving service. Mateo, when he occasionally accompanied his father to the bank, had become a minor celebrity among the employees. Not because he was the owner's son, but because his story had changed their professional lives. Many had confessed to him that the experience had made them better people, not only at work, but also in their private lives. One day, while sitting together in Alejandro's office, Mateo made an observation that deeply impacted his father. He said he had learned that when people were mean, it was usually because they were scared or sad about something. That lady who had kicked him out wasn't really bad. She was just afraid of making mistakes. Alejandro looked at his son with admiration. By age 10, Mateo had developed an understanding of human nature that many adults never achieve. When asked what he thought should be done to people who are mean out of fear, Mateo replied without hesitation that we should be even gentler with them, because being mean would scare them even more. That afternoon, Alejandro told his wife Elena about the conversation. She smiled proudly, watching her son grow in wisdom and compassion, suggested that Mateo should tell his story to help other children who were going through similar experiences. A few months later, Mateo participated in a children's television program where he recounted his experience not as a story of revenge or power, but as a lesson about the importance of not judging people by their appearance and always having the courage to be kind. The program was a huge success. Thousands of children wrote letters to Mateo recounting their experiences of discrimination or sharing acts of kindness they had performed after hearing his story. Alejandro transformed these letters into something concrete, creating the Mateo Ruiz Foundation for Kindness, which organized educational programs in schools to teach children the importance of respect and inclusion. The most significant moment came 3 years after the original incident. Carmen Lopez, the former director who had fired Mateo, requested a meeting with Alejandro. She had gone through a difficult period after being fired, but had used that experience to reflect deeply on herself. He thanked Alejandro for what he called the hardest, but most precious, lesson of his life. I had realized that I had lost sight of what really counted, treating each person with dignity and respect. Now he worked for a nonprofit organization that helped the homeless, remembering Matthew's lesson every day. Alejandro offered to share his experience in the bank's training programs as an example of how people can grow and change from their mistakes. Tonight, as he put Mateo to bed, Alejandro reflected on the extraordinary power of kindness. An 8-year-old boy treated unfairly for a few minutes had triggered a chain of changes that had touched hundreds of lives. Mateo said he was glad that thing had happened because now many people were happier. I had learned that even when bad things happen, you can always choose to turn them into good things. Alexander kissed his son's forehead, knowing that he had raised not only an heir to his business, but an extraordinary human being who would make the world a better place. The lesson was simple, but profound. In a world that often judges by appearances, true wealth lies in the ability to see the value in every person, and sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to remind us of that. Come on. I like it if you believe that every person deserves respect, regardless of appearance. Share a time when you saw or experienced unfair discrimination. Share to inspire others to never judge by appearances. Subscribe for more stories celebrating human dignity. Sometimes it takes a child to teach adults what kindness means. Sometimes a moment of injustice can become the beginning of positive change. And sometimes the most precious lesson comes when you least expect it. Because true power lies not in humiliating those who make mistakes,